Okay, it is now 4:01, and I am pleased to welcome you to our sartorial session. My name is Whitney Walton. I'm very pleased to be chairing this session, and this is called The Politics of Fashion in Mid-20th Century France. And this is going to be a great session, so stick around. Our first presenter is Tamara Chaplin. Tamara is Associate Professor of Modern European History at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She is the recipient of many awards and fellowships, most recently an NEH Summer Stipend, a Cabaret Foundation Fellowship. She is, as you probably know, the author of Turning on the Mind, French Philosophers on Television, that came out in 2007. She is currently working on a book on the history of lesbians in France, of which I think this paper is a new part. And so we are very fortunate today to hear Tamara speak on this paper topic, L'élégance lesbienne at the Cabaret féminin, Sapphic subcultural style in France, 1930 to 1960.
Thank you, Whitney. Has a new title, as you can tell from the slide behind us. That's okay. That's all right. You know, things evolve when you're working. So first, let me thank my colleagues and the audience. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Yes, today I'm going to talk about how cabarets that capitalized on desire between women, spaces that I call Sapphic cabarets, contributed to the development in France of a stylized sexual subculture, peopled by pairs composed of one masculine and one feminine woman. And this subcultural system is now commonly referred to as butch femme. And we have some of our more famous butch femme couples up here. Ellen, thank you very much. Very little is known about how butch femme as a binary sexual system came to flourish in the mid-20th century West. But regardless of national context, explanations for the masculine half of this same-sex female dyad tend to fall into one of two camps. Either female masculinity, with its unmistakably gendered sartorial expression, is thought to be biologically and psychically determined. This was the 19th century sexological explanation, reductively posed, i.e. female masculinity results when a man is trapped in a woman's body. Or it's seen as freely chosen, whether for political or personal reasons, i.e. adopting masculine dress is a way of protesting feminine oppression and claiming male privilege, or it's a way of signaling same-sex desire. And my talk tells a somewhat different story. So in what follows, I argue that the unique figure of the entraîneuse, the often cross-dressed female staff member hired to animate the Sapphic cabaret, played a special role in promoting the emergence of a sexual schema in France that is usually explained either as a pathological, a political, or a personal choice. My work reveals instead the important place of the entertainment industry in shaping French Sapphic subcultures from the inter to the post-World War II years. My goal throughout is simple. I aim to show how the sartorial practices promoted by the Sapphic cabaret sustained a repertoire of gender performances that came to signify lesbian desire in ways that proved, both to the French public and to women themselves, remarkably enduring in the decades that followed. The inadvertent outcome was that these entertainment venues supported a semiotic fashion system that enabled both personal expression and community formation, while at the same time making what was then perceived as a contagious threat, the female homosexual, instantly recognizable, and thus more easily subject to surveillance and control. So let me begin with some images. These iconic photographs were taken in 1932 by the Hungarian photographer Brassai inside Le Monocle, one of the most celebrated Sapphic cabarets in France and one of 20 that opened in the 1930s throughout the capital city that nobody else has written about, actually, but I will. What do these shots appear to tell us about the performance of female same-sex desire in interwar Paris? And if I was to ask you that, not as a rhetorical question, I think if you read those images as evidence of a flourishing butch femme subculture, you're not alone. François Buet, Florence Tamagne, Helmut Gernschein are among those who interpret these photographs as, quote, documentary statements, where the subject of homosexuality speaks for itself. Queer studies scholars, like J. Jack Halberstam, likewise argue that these photographs testify to, quote, the careful remodeling of the heterosexual matrix by butch femme couples reveling in the possibilities that Paris at night offered them in the 1930s. But is this reading accurate? My research suggests a more complicated picture, and clothing, what we wear and how and why we wear it, is at the heart of it. To that end, let's turn now to the entraîneuse, that enigmatic figure hired to drink, dance, and sometimes sleep with the clientele at the Sapphic Cabaret. The French-Cuban writer Anaïs Nin visited Le Monocle, this club, in 1934, 2 years after it opened. She reports being immediately captivated by a, quote, woman dressed like a man who attracted me. The cross-dressed young female employee in question was none other than an entraîneuse known as Fred. This is Fred here. The same Fred who by 1950 was running her own Parisian Sapphic Cabaret, Le Carroll's Club, and who was described in the international press as, quote, the most famous lesbian in the world in the 1950s. Fred, whose real name was Suzanne Jeanne Bollet, was feted for her masculine elegance. Her lovers, from the heiress Princess Zina Rashewski, and I love this, is an office wife snatching your husband? No, she's sleeping with Fred. But, and she actually later became a Buddhist nun. She's a really interesting character. To the Mexican movie star Maria Felix, to Fred's American business partner and wife, a woman with whom she lived for 22 years, Mickey Leff, who's down here, and who was called the Femme C at the Cabaret. I love that. All of these women really epitomize feminine glamour, right? As the masculine half of a lesbian couple, Fred's sartorial choices, not unlike Brassai's images, appear to suggest that butch femme gender performance simply existed in mid-century France. And moreover, that it must be explainable as either an expression of personal taste, acquired perversion, or some deep-seated biological desire. But let's dig a little bit deeper. In 1970, Fred appeared on French television in a half-hour documentary about her life, the first French broadcast to address female same-sex desire at length, although it never named it. On that program, she makes a rather astonishing revelation. When first hired in 1934 to work at Le Monocle, she was 20, a cabaret where, according to the racy society rag La Vie Parisienne, the clientele are composed exclusively of priestesses from Lesbos, Fred was actually required, she was required to transform her gender. Indeed, if Suzanne entered Le Monocle dressed as a woman, by the time that she walked back out of its doorway with a job, she was sporting a mannish black tuxedo, a straight skirt and tie, and she had assumed a new and far more masculine identity. Henceforth, the statuesque girl with the cat-like eyes would be known as Fred. And her story is not unique. According to Fred, the metamorphosis was not simple. Looking back, she reports, I had a little suit that was horrible to wear. It wasn't easy, but one didn't have a choice. One didn't have a choice. Fred's story reveals that at least some of the women who peopled Le Monocle and spaces like it cross-dressed not out of personal inclination, or at least not at first, but simply because the job demanded it. Indeed, of the 20 or so girls hired as entraîneuses at Le Monocle in 1938, while half, designated as les féminines, were outfitted in evening gowns or cocktail dresses, the rest, called les garçons, were dressed mannishly in smoking jackets, flats, straight skirts, and ties. Once obliged to adopt masculine attire, however, many entraîneuses, Fred included, soon chose this option outside of the cabaret as well. 3 decades later, for example, Danielle Dan Monel, a young mother from Normandy and one of about 100 women that I've interviewed for this project, who discovered women after her divorce, made her way to Paris and worked successively in a series of Sapphic cabarets in the 1960s. And she told me that it was only after she entered the milieu of the cabaret féminin that she consistently donned mannish garb in both her public and her private life. And you can see that parallel between the two of them. The fact that by the early 1930s, Sapphic cabaret managers believed that it was commercially advantageous to provide their female customers with women attired in both masculine and feminine dress indicates the degree to which ideas about the links between gender inversion and female homosexuality had already permeated the culture. Cabaret staff were likewise schooled in this understanding. If a masculine entraîneuse failed to attract immediate interest when she showed up at a patron's table to offer champagne or to ask a woman to dance, she was instructed to make herself scarce so that she could quickly be replaced by one of her more feminine colleagues. Importantly, such gendered practices also educated the very publics whom they sought to appeal, to whom they sought to appeal. Thus, and while true that gender transgression, of course, has a very long history, the Sapphic cabaret was significant in that it vaunted female cross-dressing, not as a form of political subversion, social theater, emancipation, modernity, or personal expression, but rather to promote and profit from female same-sex desire. And my point here is not that financial aims are suspect. What interests me, rather, is that the seeming self-evidence of the widespread decision to mobilize cross-dressing and non-normative female gender performance in order to support commercial ends. That's what really fascinates me. Sapphic cabarets used the entraîneuse as a vehicle to offer a particular vision of same-sex female desire to their customers. How did French women seeking women respond? Some were frankly delighted. Barbara Bell and her girlfriend traveled to Paris from England in the early 1930s expressly to locate lesbian nightlife. They ended up at Le Monocle, and Bell remembers, quote, "I couldn't tell whether they were men or women sitting on those stools. They were really very butchy and very femme. There were so many tables with little lamps, so many women, all lesbian, no men at all. Oh God, was I thrilled. It was out of this world. It was paradise." Bell's memory reveals both a comfort with cross-dressing and the vital importance of this female space to the women who sought it out. At the same time, whereas Bell found the experience paradise, for other women, the French Sapphic cabaret was negatively shaped by the entraîneuse. Monique Isserlet, who visited Sapphic cabarets in the 1950s, and we see her here gazing at her girlfriend at the time, told me, if I can get to the next page, "I was shocked for the entraîneurs dressed as men with whom one had to dance. I didn't like it at all. Androgyny? Yes, well, I liked a masculine side, but not when it was flaunted. These women were making a living. They had a percentage of what we drank. For them, it was a disguise." For Isserlet, it was the inauthenticity, even more than the entraîneuse's commercial role, that put her off. The problem resulted not from a discord between sex assigned at birth and gender performance. The problem was pretense, aping a desire for women that was not real. Regardless of response, the real revelation of the Sapphic cabaret lay in its numbers. It was the encounter with not just one or two cross-dressed individuals, a gym teacher, a social worker, an antiques dealer, but with entire communities of women that counted. The Sapphic cabaret, and especially the cross-dressed entraîneuses who worked there, modeled gender and sexuality as performative behaviors that could be assumed, manipulated, and transformed at will. And importantly, they modeled this en masse. As a result of the widespread publicity that these venues received, and we could talk so much about the racist imperial aspect of this particular calling card, which is Le Monocle's calling card with its Josephine Baker style dancer being consumed by the woman in the suit, but we're not going to talk about that here. The real revelation of the cabaret then lies in its numbers. As a result of the widespread publicity that the venues received during the early 1930s and the decades that followed, Sapphic cabarets rendered butch femme couples comprehensible, if not palatable, to the wider public. However, despite the growing conviction that homosexual desire, female homosexual desire, was expressed via a binary gender model, archival records reveal that, especially from the perspective of the police, 9 times out of 10, only the mannish partner was considered a lesbian. Clothing clinched the argument nearly every time. The Archives de la Préfecture de Police de Paris provide us with critical insights into the ways in which an administrative power relied on the gendered conventions of dress in its attempts to identify, if not always control, female same-sex desire. The decision to collect dossiers on women hired as entraîneuses was motivated by police interest in monitoring subversive sexual practices, in this case, lesbianism. At least 92 of these reports were prepared between 1946 and 1951. These files betray a pointed anxiety about lesbianism in the post-war moment, for almost every dossier includes an inquiry into and determination about the same-sex desires of the woman it concerns. The language, lesbienne active, lesbienne notoire, lesbienne convaincue, lesbienne de nature, or émule de Lesbos, and the sartorial criteria used to categorize women in these files imply both judgment about female same-sex desire and a specific understanding of how it operated. Namely, that it was almost assuredly present whenever women cross-dressed or otherwise transgressed gender norms. Thus, one report describes Roby as, quote, lesbienne active, always dressed as a man, haircut à la garçonne, and cigarette between her lips, who apparently cannot conceive of any other style of dress. Or take Jeanette, an entraîneuse who is also, quote, always dressed as a boy in long pants, and who recently, for fun, put on a woman's blouse and swore never to do that again, since she found the outfit too ridiculous. But the word imbecilic is actually crossed out in pink. On the other hand, if a woman's clothing and manner are feminine, the suspicions are immediately assuaged. Nothing in her dress or speech leads one to believe that LB is an adept of Lesbos. She's only there at the cabaret for the money. Again and again, the dossiers reveal that cross-dressing and female masculinity proved lesbianism, whereas femininity proved heterosexuality. In this way, the police fell victim to the same fantasy that Versailles photographs promote, the belief that image necessarily equates to reality. Women had far more nuanced perceptions of their own performative styles and sexual behavior. And I love this. This is actually the manager of Le Monocle, Lulu. The responses to accusations of lesbianism are instructive. Most, not surprisingly, denied the charge. Many claim that they only worked in these venues for the money, often presenting their children as justification for the choice. Others argued that when hired, they were innocent of the special ambiance of these places. Some were not, had never been, and likely never would be involved with women. But others, like Conchita, a severe-looking 33-year-old Spaniard working on an immigrant's visa and employed in the milieu since 1938, pulled no punches. As concerns her morals, her file reports, she doesn't hide her repulsion for the stronger sex and her passion for persons of her own gender. The comment is also underlined in pink. Moreover, the agent concludes, she makes no effort at discretion since she is almost always dressed as a man. Let me emphasize that at issue here is not whether these women actually are lesbians. Rather, these sources highlight how important it was to the police to make this determination, show how they relied on clothing as a sign of sexual deviance, illustrate the ways in which women attempted to respond to the categories that the police administration imposed, and help us to explore the conditions under which a subject, identified as the lesbian, was forming in France in the early to mid-20th century. What we're witnessing is a moment in which the varieties of erotic possibility are foreclosed by an analytic process bent on forcing all female sexual desire into one of two possible categories, in which normal women dress like women and lesbians dress like men. These files simultaneously reveal that while some of the women who dressed as men in the Sapphic cabarets desired other women and others did not, all of the women who worked in these spaces had an impact on the construction of an identity that came to be recognized as lesbian. So in conclusion, Sapphic cabarets enabled female customers interested in same-sex intimacy to respond to three imperatives: the need to seduce other women, the need to evade the male gaze, the need for group identification, the constitution of community. The commodification of female cross-dressing and butch femme performance facilitated these ends. The complex character of the cross-dressed entraîneuse reveals that as the dynamic product of multiple influences, individual, communal, social, commercial, female masculinity and femininity both had multiple meanings within this environment and multiple effects. On the one hand, in a world that silenced same-sex desire, cross-dressing was a part of non-normative gender performance that served a critical communicative function. On the other, promotion of butch femme as a sexual system helped to secure the hegemony of binary genders, while reinforcing the powerful but mistaken belief that contingently constructed categories, butch, femme, were a priori ahistorical ontological truths. As the more immediately distinguishable of the two, it also rendered the butch, now thought to be inextricable from deviant sexuality, vulnerable to surveillance and persecution. Now, this talk treats the period from the early 30s to the 60s as a cohesive whole. My justification is that the butch femme sexual system promoted within the Sapphic cabaret was critical to both the public perception and the communal experience of same-sex female desire throughout this period. It also shaped personal practices. But I would not want my emphasis on continuities to obscure the fact that the war years reinforced heteronormative paradigms and augmented homophobia. In 1942, as most of you know, the collaborationist Vichy regime outlawed same-sex acts committed with a partner under the age of 21, while leaving the age of heterosexual majority at 13. General de Gaulle retained the discriminatory ruling at the war's end. It seems likely that the very existence of the files collected by the Brigade Mondaine in the immediate aftermath of the war on the entraîneuse were a direct response to these broader government efforts to discourage same-sex activity. So the Sapphic cabaret was a unique social space in which the sartorial expression of female same-sex desire was understood, embodied, and identified in 20th century France. The role of the entraîneuse is particularly enigmatic in this story. It reveals that female masculinity could be either learned or imposed, while raising the possibility that some of the cross-dressed women in France's Sapphic cabarets may not have been erotically interested in other women at all. As such, it illustrates how commercial culture played an important part in shaping French Sapphic fashions, sexual subjectivities, and especially butch femme roles, not just at this time, but for generations to come. Of course, the fact of the entraîneuse does not negate evidence of butch femme subcultures forming outside of the Sapphic cabarets in these years. What it does do is complicate our understanding of how, why, and when this happened. What else does it tell us? For one, ironically, it displays just how deeply established the identification between cross-dressing and Sapphism already was in France when Le Fétiche, the very first French Sapphic cabaret, opened its doors in 1926. Indeed, those who ran these venues and required female staff to wear masculine dress are evidence that even before the 1930s, there was an increasingly widespread understanding that, at least in some quarters, what at least some women who loved women wanted was a woman dressed as a man. Thank you.